Tim Baker, good to have you back on the show.
Good to be back, Tim. What's good?
So we're going live with this episode right around 4th of July. So happy 4th of July to our listeners out there, which means for us at YFP that this is the time every year, Tim, that we take a week off. We shut down the offices, the team. We use it as a mid-year reflection and break. So what big plans do you have coming up for the week?
Childcare, I think. Yeah. Shay was like, "Oh, maybe we don't need our summer nanny," and I'm like, "Well, I was trying to just relax for a little bit, jokingly, but we might use her for summer or summer swim practice in the morning, and then I'm gonna plan some things with the two oldest to have some good one-on-one time. We're not going anywhere, which is kind of a first. We typically travel, but Tim, as you know, we put a pretty big addition, like a porch on the back of the house recently, and has a fireplace and a swim spa. So I think I'm going to be spending some time out there and just soaking up some vitamin D and just thinking about first half of the year and, what we need to do to be successful for the second half of the year. So I'm looking forward to, recharging the batteries a bit. How about you?
Yeah, so we also will be home for the week, which we don't usually travel this week. We travel later in July, usually with my family up to the Finger Lakes in New York. Beautiful part of the country. So this week we'll be home. We've got some baseball tournaments, I think some soccer stuff going on. We'll be up at my in-laws for 4th of July,
Nice.
Some family traditions there. So good week. I love this time of the year. I think it's that point, which is also true with our financial plan, but it's at that point in the year where it's like, hey, that first of the year, the turn into the new year feels like a distant memory. We had some big goals going into the year, and the year gets busy as it does every year. It's a nice natural point to slow down, pause, reflect, make some adjustments as we come into the second half of the year.
Yeah, and I guess before I was running my own business, I kind of just never really thought about it, and I think you just keep on, it's just 4th of July isn't any old holiday, but I think it's a good, I think it's just a good natural pause midway through to just say, hey, let's just check in and see where we're at. And, I think there's a lot of people out there that, will have, goals, that they might set for, a New Year's resolution that maybe fall by the wayside after a month or two or three. And I think this is kind of just a good time to dust those off and just see how are we trended in 2025, because it's going by fast, or at least it seems that way. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to just having some time to relax and reflect and really just kind of set up the second half of the year. I can't believe I'm saying that because it feels like 2025 just started, but
it does.
Here we are.
And I think that point of reflection, Tim, relates well to what we're talking about today, which is considerations during a job transition. And a lot of this could also apply for those that are staying within an organization, but might be taking on a new role or promotion. But even more so for those that are going through a transition. Yes, there are some tactical things that we want to think about and consider. We'll talk about those during the show, but it's also just a natural point of reflection. I remember the job transitions I've gone through with a couple different institutions. One of those in particular led to a move from one part of Ohio to another part of Ohio. There was a little bit of time off. So I think that can happen where we're in these seasons of transition. And especially as it relates to the financial plan, it's such a good time to just stop, slow down a little bit, and start to take stock of the financial plan and get an idea of, hey, where are we at? Where are we going? Why are we going there? Are we on track? And what do we need to do differently, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we'll talk about, it will be more of the, hey, let's talk about benefits and how taxes change. But, I think something like a job change, and you see this with a home purchase, and it's, I think sometimes a way to rationalize into a purchase is you're willing to be a lot more flexible or bendy on what your goals are. So if I get this job, if we buy this house, maybe that, big annual vacation that we do internationally is not as important, right? So I think I think that, again, I part of, I think, financial planning is, if you can imagine a paper map that we used to have back in the days, is kind of getting that paper map off the dash opening it up and saying like, are we still on the trajectory that we want to go on? Are we still on the right path? Right. And we're going to talk about the technical side of it. But I think with a job change or like a home purchase or things like that, I think it's worthy of your time to check in just to say like, hey, these goals that I had that maybe I established a year or two ago with my financial planner or with my spouse or whatever, do these still apply? Like we have new data, right? And one of the things that we talk about internally is, the client that will be like, hey, I got it from here. Like nothing's going to change in the next 5 years, which I get it. I know that's how that can feel, but like, I always challenge that assumption, because if you look back a year or 2 or 3, let alone 5, so much has changed. Right. And I think it's kind of, foolish is not the word, but it's kind of that belief that, hey, we're going to be on autopilot for the next 5 years is not correct. Right. So oftentimes what leads prospective clients to me to see if we're a good fit are things like a job change or a move or a home purchase or a retirement or, maybe an empty nester if that's a different phase, for some people. So I do think that so much of these, I wouldn't say, I don't know if rite of passage, but these milestones in life, and job change could be one of them, can be very important for us just to say, let's look at the map and say, are we on track? Is this what we want to do? And it kind of ties in with what we're talking about with kind of midway through the year, just being self-reflective, right? And just saying like, is what we're doing, is that what we want? Is this what we want? Is this a wealthy life for us today and tomorrow?
Yeah, I think it naturally just shakes things up a little bit, right? And kind of forces us to look at the different parts of the plan. And, Tim, when you said paper maps in the spirit of summer, you took me right back to some of the road trips growing
Remember
up.
like the AAA?
Oh, the triptychs.
Like
yes.
The books.
With the highlights, the map.
Yeah.
Where are we at, Mom? Page 17, where are we at? Yeah.
Someone was telling me they still do that. I'm like, that cannot be correct.
No way.
That can't be correct. This is like if someone was reading, like on the YouTube channel and reading, like listen to this, is like comment below if you know that they still do this, because someone was saying that. I'm like, that cannot be correct. There's no way.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, I'm a proud AAA member. So I'm gonna call in and ask them for a triptych just for fun. See if I know one. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to talk about 7 different areas. What we're going to do, each one of these briefly, and actually I think all of these we've talked about at length on the show before. And so as we go through each section, I'm going to reference some of the materials that we've done before. You can go check out those episodes for more information on those, as I do think each one certainly warrants, a lot more consideration, but lots to consider as we're thinking about a job transition or promotion. Tim, the first one, and hopefully for folks that are in the midst of a job transition, this is something that is still in play, would be evaluating the offer and specifically looking at negotiation. And we've talked about this a couple times on the show. Most recently, episode 384, we talked about negotiating your value in the workplace. But points of transition, my experience tells me that the transition points, promotion, or a new employer are really the opportunities to negotiate and make the big jumps. And often the biggest jumps come from one organization to another, right? Sometimes it's an opportunity to level set. If you've been with an organization for 10, 15, 20 years, maybe you've been giving promotions under the guise of cost of living adjustments, whatever it is, and there may be an opportunity to really level set the compensation to the value that you bring. So negotiation's a big topic, lots to consider here, but I think one of the first questions we have to ask is negotiation warranted? Do we have an opportunity to negotiate? Do we have leverage to negotiate? So Tim, if I'm listening, how do I know whether or not I should negotiate an offer?
Yeah, I would just hit you with a stat that says, and I believe this is from SHRM, which I equate this as like the APHA of like HR.
Yeah.
And I saw a stat that they put out that says like 99% of hiring managers expect prospect hires to negotiate. And I think to further that, I think that hiring managers will build their initial offer as such, meaning let's say they have a budget of $140,000. They might offer 120, knowing that there's that expectation that the prospective hire comes back and, asks for more. So I often say it's kind of like just do it, right? The I think the the problem here is that a lot of pharmacists, just a lot of people in general, don't necessarily have the tools, to equip them to feel comfortable. And if you don't do it often, it's not a comfortable conversation. And, pharmacists, I think, become pharmacists a lot of reasons to help other people. And this is, I feel like an instance where you're putting yourself to the front of the line, right? And, again, I look at this as kind of like we talk about the mass, like help yourself first and then help your client or whatever. So like, I really think that it's important to understand the leverage that you have, understand the job market, understand where you're at in your career. I will say that the further away that you get from pharmacy school, typically the more leverage that you have, typically the more specialized you are, typically the more leverage you have. Understanding what your worth is. So just understanding, like, is this a good offer? Is this a bad offer? And understanding like what the salary numbers, and then also understand that an offer is not just about salary, right? It's you want to look at the total package of compensation, and the headliner is going to be salary. And that's often, as so many people do on social media, they read the headline and they act accordingly. It's really important to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what the compensation package is, because you can move up in salary, but you could take a major step back from cash in your pocket due to other things like health insurance and things like that.
Yeah, Tim, one example, just to highlight that point, I think about my first academic job. This would have been 2000, and $100,000 starting salary, which is pretty good for an academic position back in 2009. But certainly below market value of what you would think of a practicing pharmacist, right? So you look at that headline and you're like, well, it's not an average pharmacist salary, but it's an academic position. I think academics just kind of accept like it's lower than what's out there, right? However, you start to look at the benefits and so forth, and you extrapolate that to total compensation, very, very competitive, right? State retirement plan, at the time.
PSLF, which I know wasn't on your radar, but
PSLF.
I think that nonprofit status, again, assuming that the PSLF program is going to continue to stay, which I think it will, that's a huge thing that I think a lot of employers don't think about, to be honest.
Yeah. So the nonprofit status, the obviously the great healthcare benefits, but I was thinking in particular about the retirement match I'd have to look back exactly what it was. I think we were forced like a 13-14% contribution. They put in 10, 11, or 12. Granted, we didn't, weren't getting Social Security credits because we were excluded from that. But all that to say, right, what gets the headline, as you mentioned, is the compensation. But we have to make sure we're looking at the entire, package, salary, non-salary, and then obviously some of the broader components about like, do we enjoy the work that we do, the culture, the organization, the opportunities for growth, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think even to go further, like when you left Ohio State to come to YFP, like if we would have paid you the exact same thing of what you were paid at Ohio State, your pay would still have been significantly different because of health insurance, like significant, right? And that's one of the hard things to kind of discern, when you're looking at an offer. Like it's hard until you get that first pay stub to really understand that. But that, I think, is an extreme example of how nice OSU's benefits were, and again, that's kind of the small print of an offer, and not that anyone's trying to hide anything, but there's a major needle mover that could be related to health insurance and some other things that you're just not accounting for, and because the headline grabber is going to be base compensation, or base salary, I should say.
And one of the things I was thinking about with this is, you talked about this being a learned skill. When we've talked on the show about this topic before, we often reference the book Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Great resource just to get you thinking about negotiation as a learned skill, and kind of the art of the different stages and the techniques that could be employed in the negotiation process, and why negotiation is really starting. I would argue it's starting like pre-interview in the conversations that you're having in your application, and certainly goes all the way throughout. And we're often too late when we're thinking about negotiation, later on in the offer. But particular piece I want to get your feedback on is you have worked with many of our clients. You're the de facto resource on the team for negotiation. And through that experience, I'm curious to hear from you what you've picked up on in terms of some of the mindset that you're seeing from pharmacists. Because it's one thing to say, hey, as years of experience go, so does your leverage. As your areas of specialty go, so does your leverage. As your, obviously the type of work that you're doing, the impact you're having. But to actually believe that and to bring that belief into the negotiation is another thing. And I think sometimes having a third party, like having you help someone in a negotiation can almost help someone get out of their own head a little bit and objectively see the value that they're bringing, and almost to mirror back to them a level of confidence that they can then bring into the negotiation.
Yeah, I think that's the word that I was going to use is confidence. I think that's the key thing, and it's a little bit about it took however many years for a person to run like a 4-minute mile, and then once somebody did it, then like that record kept happening. I think when we show clients that like others have done this and the client has given us feedback of like what they got, or what the result was, I think that gives one confidence that they can do this. I just think that the natural, the default of most people is, I shouldn't say this. This is my money script and my money baggage, but like I grew up where like it was rude to talk about money, right? You don't talk about salary, things like that. So like I early in my career before I got into financial services, I had just this natural aversion for money. Like I just thought it was something that you don't discuss out in the open, especially like salary. And I think a lot of people
ask for more.
Yeah. I think a lot of people that are listening to this resonate with that. So, I think part of it is modeling that this is possible. And then I think this is at all levels, right? There's some employers that will say like, we don't negotiate, right? Or we're too big. This is a machine. Like we've seen results from like people that work for the government, right? So I think that everything is negotiable. And a lot of people want to hear me say that, but it is, right? And I think a little bit of back and forth negotiation when they've identified you as the right candidate is fine. I think a lot of people get scared that an offer will be rescinded or things like that. I don't think that to be the case. I think it's just equipping yourself with the tools to have the conversation, and giving you the confidence. I think for a lot of people that I talk to, like when I ask that question, it's not even really a thought in their mind. The default is like, oh, I'm just happy to have a job. And then it's like, well, you should think about a counter offer, what your worth is. And they're like, well, I don't even really know where to start. And that's where we kind of get into some of these tools. So, I think like, it's just something that I think you have to learn. It's not a natural thing for most people. But I think it's important. And I think one of the things you talked about is, jump in organizations can sometimes, I mean, when we talk about pharmacists, one of the salary is a great thing, but one of the downsides of it is that outside of cost of living, you don't really see leaps and bounds that you see in other professions, where it's like you start at, and then 10 years later, you're making 250. We don't see that in pharmacy. So I think it is really important to advocate for yourself, and do it in a way that I think is respectful and within bounds. I think for people, that's not a natural thing that they have.
Yeah, and again, this isn't just for job transition. I think there's an internal component here. Even if it's not a new role or a promotion, I think
it's
there's
a review.
Tendency.
Yeah,
it's a review. Yeah, absolutely. And just looking at where's compensation to value, and I think I don't have any data to back this up, but going from my own experience, I think the longer you're in an organization, the more likely is for your compensation to become stale. Obviously just looking at so much of the pie to go around, and I know there'd be instances where we'd have new hires coming to the organization, right? And obviously there's dollars for new positions, and retention should be a key component and factor, but it's just the way it is, sometimes. So you have to be advocating for yourself. And I think really having the confidence as you talked about, and I would reference people again back to 384. We talked about this in detail. Check out Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference. Great resource. But this on some level is always going to feel uncomfortable because you're not practicing this skill on a regular basis, like you said earlier.
Yeah, it is. And I think something that we talk about, to be in the accusation audit, like, when I do like very high level negotiation, I talk about if the central piece of negotiation is a counteroffer, then to break that down, I think about it in three parts. You have the one bookend, which is the accusation audit, which is, this is what takes the air out of the room or the sting out. So it's the worst thing that, so Tim, if you're hiring me and you give me an offer, I'm like, oh man, I don't want to like upset Tim, and I feel really greedy, or maybe I'm not qualified. So my accusation on it would be, hey Tim, I really appreciate the offer. I can see myself fitting in really nicely to the YFP organization. You're probably going to think that I'm asking for way too much. You're probably thinking that I'm not qualified for this position. So that's the accusation on it. So when someone says that, it kind of disarms them, right?
No, Tim.
Yeah,
no,
that's not what I think. That's not what I think at all, and you just point to the elephant in the room, right? So that's really the first part to kind of set up. It's kind of like, what is it? It's like, no offense, but, or, you say something, and there's another one that's like, not to be offensive or whatever it is. And then you say that offensive thing. So you kind of set the conversation up. So that's the first part. The second part is, I think, the actual counteroffer. And I think this is understanding how to construct this. So studies have shown is that if you give a range versus like an exact number, it's more of like you're willing to kind of work with inside of that range. And it has to be like a weirdly imprecise. And Chris Voss, I think, talks about this in his book, but it's like, it's as if you have actually calculated your value. So like when I present on this, I show the Zach Galifianakis, equation meme where he's like, at the casino.
Yeah.
And that is a more potent, hey, this is what my value is, versus like, hey, just pay me $100,000 or $150,000. Those zeros are very brittle, right? So it's like, I'd rather you say I'm looking for 105,900 or 105,785 to 135,693. Now that sounds ridiculous saying it. In text, it's not as much, so you can abbreviate it, but it's to try to find your range, and then you end that with a calibrated question. So a calibrated question is really a how or a what question, and it's kind of like a where should we go from here? And that's a weird question. How should we proceed? What about this works for you? Doesn't work for you? What should we do next? And it's very much open-ended and kind of like an ask for help. So sometimes when you ask like why questions or things like that, it can be accusatory, and you don't want to be accusatory because negotiations can get emotional. But it's like, how does this look for you? That type of thing. So to me, it's setting up the counteroffer in like those three parts. You have the bookends, which are, you have you have the accusation audit, you have what your ask is, which could be salary, it could also be non-salary, which we haven't talked about. And then you end it on, how can we proceed? What about this works for you, doesn't work for you? And then you just let it hang out there and see what happens. So those are that's typically the structure that I like to walk clients through, to, again, advocate, make a counter, and go from there.
I love that approach. I think it's simple. It's easy to remember. It's disarming. It's authentic. It's still it's in the spirit of building relationship. And I in particular, I like all those questions on the back end, but I like the one best where you share like, what about this works for you? What about this doesn't, work for you? And I think the key there is then like holding the space and allowing for a response that will be valuable information that you can take on, further into the process.
Yeah. And when I did this with Shay, with one of her, negotiations, when she was changing jobs, she works in construction. The response, I think she was doing this over email. the response to this is like, I'm going to try to find this money for you. So it was like recruiting your counterpart to like help the cause.
Yeah.
Like we had some feedback recently where, we were helping with negotiation, and our client was like, my supervisor responded saying that my ask seems reasonable and need to get approval from the VP, which happened the next day. So it was almost like that person that she was dealing with was kind of recruited for the cause, and then it got pushed through. So that's what it is, right? And I think to go back to the accusation audits, like to your point, genuine's the operative term, right? Like, I don't want you to say something that you don't feel, but for a lot of people, they feel like, oh man, I'm asking for too much. Like I think that authenticity is really important, to have that.
Great stuff. A lot more to talk about in the negotiation, but a good reminder that negotiation is a really valuable part of the plan. Job transition, job promotion is a natural point to have those conversations, but certainly not limited to those two examples.
Yeah.
Second area, Tim, benefits optimization. We talked about this in episode 328, how to navigate open enrollment employer benefits. Again, we alluded to this briefly, talking about some of the non-salary components. But we know that our CFPs do a lot of work with our clients, typically around open enrollment, but also with a job transition to ensure that we're maximizing the employer benefits, since this is a key part of the total compensation and can vary significantly from one employer to the next. So briefly, what are some of those key things that those going through a job transition should be evaluating as it relates to the optimization of benefits?
Yeah. So some people, they can kind of go through this, and I've seen some open enrollment and like new hire where it's very well laid out for the new person, where it kind of explains everything. And then there's some that are not, and they need a little bit more help, from one of our planners. The heavy hitters here are going to be things like your retirement plan. Is there a 401k, a 403b, a 401a? Is there access to a 457? Are there Roth and traditional options available? Is there a match, and when does that happen? There are a lot of plans that you can't get into until you're, there for a year, or sometimes you can get into it, but then you don't get a match until, after a year. What is the vesting schedule? So vesting is, basically it's a kind of a version of golden handcuffs where, Tim, if I'm your employee and I put, 5% of my salary into the 401k, then you would match, let's say 4%. But if I were to leave after a certain amount of time, like if I were to leave, then I don't get that match. I have to stay there for a time to basically get those dollars, for me to have that. So it could be a vesting schedule, like I said, timeline of contribution. So I think another thing to obviously look at is like the quality investments that are inside the plan. So we've talked about like not every 401k, if I use that synonymously with the other plans, are created equal. So, sometimes it doesn't make sense to use the 401k, or we fill up some other buckets because the 401k is hot garbage, right? So we really want to make sure that we take a look at that. Obviously the healthcare plans and what's available to you. Does it give you access to an HSA? What's covered, what's not, understanding like what's in network, if you have to change doctors or out of network, understanding what your out-of-pocket max is, your premiums, deductibles, all that stuff. Do you have access to like an FSA, which could be a healthcare FSA, or there's also a dependent care FSA that you can use for, childcare, or if you're caring for an elderly parent, that type of thing. Is there stock or equity, options available? An employee stock purchase plan. These are all kind of different things that you understand in insurance cover, like life insurance, long-term, short-term disability. There's often a lot of fluff around some of these policies, especially life insurance, that it's like, that's garbage. You shouldn't worry about that. A lot of plans don't necessarily have short-term disability. So like, do you go out and buy your own policy? Oftentimes we probably not, but like, what does it cover? How is that going to change the plan? Because it could be different from your previous employer. Understanding like your time off, your PTO, and then other things, right? So do you get help with professional development or conferences? Is there any student loan assistance? there was a relocation, do you get a
Mhm.
cell phone, a cell phone, or is that, or do you get mileage if you're traveling between sites? So kind of understanding those, a lot of firms will also, or a lot of companies, I should say, also have like a not a nonprofit, a charitable, like if you
Yep.
contribute, so understanding how that fits into your giving strategy. So just looking at this, I think strategically when you start, then obviously yearly when you're going through your open enrollment is important. But like we mentioned, if you add up all these things, it can move the needle, right? Especially when you're talking about retirement and healthcare. It's not just about salary. So understanding, the different things here and what is in your best interest to elect or not elect, I think is a
Mhm.
major part of, a transition, or even eternally as you're thinking about compensation.
Yeah, and there's a lot to consider here, and some of these, may align with what you had in your previous job. Some may not,
Yeah.
and so they present different planning opportunities. You mentioned some unique things like a 457, a 401a, or maybe you didn't previously have access to a high deductible health plan and HSA, but now you do. And obviously, life changes that can happen along the way as well, which change how you look at some of these benefits and what's there. So I'm thinking back to just some of the moments I've been in orientation meetings where, I'm sure they don't give stacks of papers anymore, but stacks of papers, all the other things, you're trying to get started with your new job. And these can easily be overlooked, but are really important and critical, and also influence other decisions we're making. For example, when we're making decisions on buying life insurance or disability insurance, what does our employer offer? And how does that feed into some of the decisions of what additional coverage we need outside of that? So lots of pieces here. And shout out to our team, because I know this is an area where they can spend sometimes a significant amount of time that may be overlooked in more of a traditional planning, setting, just because of the details and depth that can be there in the planning process. Tim, the third area is a chance to refresh the spending plan, to refresh the budget. And really, regardless of how formal or informal, the budget is, whether someone's following a strict budget or just kind of loosely looking at something more like a no budget, naturally, assuming that there might be changes in compensation and take home pay, maybe some unique expenses to transition that are going on, it's a time where we can recast the spending plan, look at the cash flow available, perhaps hedge against, just some of the risk of those dollars going elsewhere without intention. What thoughts do you have here on how a job transition presents a good opportunity for us to refresh the spending plan and recast what we're trying to do with some of these goals?
Yeah, I just think it's really important to note, like, even if you're like a no budget, that's still a budget, and understanding like, where your money is going is going to be, it's always important. Even when we're building
Mhm.
retirement paychecks, we kind of use that information to kind of derive what the check is. So, the oftentimes with a job change comes a change in pay. Not always, but often it does. So I think it's really good to, kind of review your pay stub when it starts to come in, and hopefully we have the right, taxes taken out, which I know we'll talk about, but, to understand, okay, this is my net pay every week, every 2 weeks, once a
Yeah.
month, whatever it is, understand the frequency, and then just recast, the goals and how you're funding goals, and, what's important there. I think on the day-to-day stuff, like, how does the new job affect things like commuting costs, or
Mhm.
parking, or, have you added or subtracted state licensures and things like that? Do you have to worry about a home office now? There are expenses there. Like, what are the out of pocket? So I think those are more tangible. But then, if you increase pay, or if you have different types of compensation, like that can change your tax situation. So you have to account for that. Like, if you're paying more for gas and some other, non-discretionary monthly expenses, that could affect your emergency fund and what we
Mhm.
need to set aside for that. So, I think it's really important, I think, to take, again, the opportunity to understand, what is coming in, and on what frequency, and then review your expenses. If you haven't done this in a while, you can see how like recurring, expenses can add up, that you might assess like, hey, I'm not using this, or, so I think it's just a good time to just take a look, at least in a 90-day snapshot, 180-day snapshot post, your hire, and, ensure that you understand how your money's coming in, and then how it's being allocated. And, a job change is a really great time to do that.
Yeah, I like to think about these expenses as, which of these are going to hit, the budget on a month-to-month basis for the long term. So you talked about commuting costs and some of those types of things. And then which of these might be more one-time or short-term
Yeah.
expenses. So, if I have a gap in employment, for example, and do I need to figure out a solution short-term for healthcare insurance, whether that be COBRA coverage or something in between? Are there relocation related expenses, right? Things that aren't going to necessarily hit the budget 2 years down the road, but we need to be factoring in, in the short term as we're looking at this transition. Since you mentioned tax system, let's go there as the fourth area for financial considerations with a job transition. How can a new job or raise within an organization, promotion, impact someone's tax situation and some of the things they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so it could push you into a higher or lower tax bracket. I think that's good to know, as you're planning, and we can kind of tie in investments. A lot of your, if your ability to fund a Roth directly, things like that are tied to your income. Um, you know, even, kind of more on the boots on the ground is like, how do you set up your W-4 and adjust your withholdings? I think is really important. And some of that can be a trial and error. I experienced that personally. It's just the W-4 and that whole system of how you would adjust, how identify what you want to withhold is, I think, just broken. So, and, I would say obviously work with a tax professional, but sometimes it might take you a couple times to, submit your W-4 where you feel comfortable with what you're actually withholding. Um, but yeah, understanding how you phase out of deductions or credits. If you have variable income, or, if you got a sign-on bonus, how are the taxes, account it for that? You might have to set up, some dollars aside, or a lot of time bonuses, they'll withhold the taxes for you. Another thing to think about too is like, do you have multi-state concerns, right? So if you're working in one and commuting to another, or you're working, in a job that, you're just in multiple states, like how does that affect things? So I think it's important, again, as a check of when you are changing jobs, just to kind of just look at your overall tax situation and adjust accordingly. So it could be the W-4, just could be where you're at the tax bracket. It could be an investment related thing. Hey, now it might make sense to, do more pre-tax and less Roth, or vice versa. So just taxes, again, permeate everything. It's always there. And a job transition is a good time to just check on that and see how you're doing.
Yeah, tax is the thread, right? And I'm glad you made the connection between, the third area we talked about and the fourth area here, tax planning, right? Because some of these components, as we're looking at changes in tax situation, it may then lead us to some decisions of what we want to do in terms of pre-tax, post-tax contributions and other strategic moves we want to make with the financial plan.
Yep.
So far, we've talked about four areas related to financial considerations with the job transition. We talked about the negotiation side of this. We talked about benefits optimization, refreshing, recasting the budget or the spending plan, and then tax planning. I'm going to hit 5 and 6 briefly, because 5, which is handling old retirement accounts, we just talked about this on episode 408. What should you do with an old 401k? And we're going to link to that episode in the show notes. One of the most common questions that we get, and often it may not just be one old account, but it could be several old accounts that have been hanging out. And we've got options from leaving it to bringing it over to our new employer or rolling it over in an IRA. And there's considerations with each one of those that we want to factor in. So make sure to check out that episode. But if we're making a job transition or job move, obviously that's an important thing that we need to be thinking about. And then the sixth item we've been touching on throughout the show, which is this opportunity to take a step back and have that long-term view. So how might a career change or how might a job change be a good opportunity to zoom out and just evaluate the financial plan at large to see where things are at in terms of the retirement side of the financial plan, and are we striking that balance that we talk about so often on the show between preparing for the future while also prioritizing today. And again, especially when someone's in the middle of their career, it feels like days can quickly turn into years. And so it's just an opportunity to slow down, broaden out, take a look at the financial plan. Where are we on track? Where are we not? And what are some adjustments that we can make going forward? So that long-term outlook, I think, is key. Tim, the final area, and I want to get your input on this. It's something we actually haven't talked about a lot And I'm calling this the quality of the advice. And in particular, what I'm referring to here are some of the workplace provided solutions for financial planning, if we want to call it that. An example I give is when I was up at Northeast Ohio Medical University, we had several options of vendors that we could work with for our 403B. One of those was Valak, and through Valak, you could have access to financial planning, financial advice. And I quickly realized that, what that turned into was, a direction towards some of the Valak products, some very, very, very light retirement planning type of work, but it was far from what we think about with comprehensive financial planning. So what is your experience with prospective clients, or even in your own experience? Tell about that quality of advice and what opportunities we may have available to us in our workplace, or where we might want to be looking for help outside of that.
Yeah, typically like a workplace advisor is really the scope of work that they can advise on is really like the retirement plan that they're helping like administer for the employer. So it might be like, hey, I can help you with a Valak 403B or whatever it is, and very, very light on financial planning. So I often hear that a lot. It's like, oh, we work with a financial plan. Like I would say, this is your first rodeo working with a financial planner. A lot of people will say like, oh no, you've like worked with a planner. But then when I kind of go through the scope of work that we do versus like what their previous advisor, it's like apples and oranges, right? And there's probably a pharmacy analogy that I can make there, but just not the same, right? And no shade on them. It's oftentimes they're kind of constricted. They're not necessarily supposed to, because oftentimes they don't have like a signed engagement. So for anybody to give like investment advice, there needs to be kind of like a signed client agreement, and the scope of work is pretty restricted, right? So it's very, very, very light. It's kind of more of a, hey, it's like an FAQ line. That's what it is. So, and for some people that might be good enough, right? I think again, what we said for most pharmacists that are in the top echelon in terms of salary and net worth, probably something a little bit more comprehensive and holistic is in line, right? So, but it's hard, right? When we talk about advisors, it's super confusing to the to a regular consumer. Like I remember when you and Tim were writing the 7-Figure Pharmacist book, like just doing the chapter of like selecting a financial, like I was getting confused, and I'm in the industry, right? Yeah. So there's lots of different flavors. I think to me, it's just finding, what is it that you're looking for? I think transparency is a big thing, which again, the industry is not great about. Understanding like what's the scope of work for the fee that you're being charged, and, find a situation that I think again, puts your interests ahead of anybody else's. So, and I will say like typically in a job transition, you are often, you might, it's like, let's say you've been working with not like a retirement specialized advisor, but you were working with an advisor that everyone knows their name, and they've ignored you for a long time, but now you're moving jobs. You might become their new best friend because there's assets on the table. So I would just understand assets on the table in terms of like a rollover opportunity. So what I'm saying here is just understand like the angles, and where follow the money. And I think it's important to understand that, because again, transparency I think is something that financial services has to kind of continue to improve, because it's just not there.
Yeah, and again, we talked about this not too long ago, episode 404, 5 key questions asked when hiring a financial planner. We talked all about what are the questions that you want to ask, obviously, but also different ways that advisors get compensated, understanding what is or may not be involved in financial planning. And I think that's relevant here as we're talking about, workplace advisors, or perhaps somebody's listening and they work with an advisor outside of the workplace, or you're a DIYer thinking about hiring an advisor. Good information to know, just the way the market is set up, the way that financial advisors are constructed in terms of the business and regulation. It's really the ownership of the client to understand what's included, what's involved in that relationship, and ask good questions to make sure it's a good fit. And if you're listening and wondering, hey, what would it look like to work with YFP and our team of fee-only certified financial planners. As always, you can go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, our homepage. From the homepage, you'll see an option to book a discovery call. That'd be a conversation with Tim Baker, typically about 45 to 60 minutes, where we can have an opportunity to learn more about your situation, your goals, what's working, what's not working, share more about our services, and ultimately determine together whether or not that's a good fit. So, Tim, as always, appreciate the insights, and thanks so much for listening, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.